Hello, my name is Daniel Stillwell. I am the editor of the IFTA e-newsletter, and we have with us today Dylann Lowery. She is a doctoral student at Florida State University here in the United States, and she is one of our award-winning recipients of the World Family Therapy Congress Student Scholarship for her presentation, and it's entitled Echoes of Childhood, a qualitative study on ACEs and co-parenting dynamics. So thank you so much, Dylann, for being with us here today.
Yeah, thanks for having me. I'm excited to get to talk with you.
Wonderful. So the first question that I wanted to ask is, since we have clinical people that watch this from all over the world, who do you identify as with your professional hat? What terms do you use, and what does that look like in the context where you practice, supervise, etc.?
Yeah, so I am a licensed marriage and family therapist. So MFT for short is what we call ourselves. And I specialize in trauma-informed care and interpersonal trauma. So meaning that I see people and how they operate in relationships, both like people relationships, but also the context relationships. So where they work, the political systems that impact them, how the government is running right then. So that's kind of how I contextualize my work. I'm also working towards my registered play therapy credentials currently. So having people move their bodies, do things differently rather than maybe traditional talk therapy. But I work with individuals, couples, and families where at least one member has experienced a form of trauma or adverse childhood experience, which translates to my research.
Awesome. Yes, translates to your research, your dissertation, and your presentation. So you can kind of go wherever you want, but tell us a little bit about what you're presenting at IFTA and why it's interesting, why it matters, any takeaways that you can give us.
Yeah, so I'm doing a little snippet of my dissertation. So we did phase one where we sent out a survey collecting data on adverse childhood experiences and the co-parenting relationship. Then currently, this is what my project is over for IFTA, is we interviewed people with a clinically significant ACEs score. So we have the ACEs measure. So anyone 4+, I invited to be a part of the interview to really discuss these dynamics of how their childhood influences co-parenting relationships. That was kind of the gap in the literature. We talk a lot about romantic relationships and how that's influenced from ACEs, but not as much co-parenting relationships where you may or may not be romantically involved anymore. And so when we coded these interviews, we really found that how people describe their childhood really was influenced by how many ACEs they experienced. So when I say that, I mean those between 4 and 6 really were able to see maybe positives and negatives of their childhood experience, and vice versa with their co-parents. They saw their co-parents and like, well, they experienced this hardship, but there were also positives versus those who had 6 or 7 ACEs. They saw their childhood as the worst of the worst, is how they kind of described it. But they also talked about their co-parents' childhood as, oh, they had it the best. Their parents loved them. So it's really this interesting contrast of maybe balance between positive and negatives versus kind of how they viewed themselves and their co-parent as one was positive and one was negative, which I found really interesting. The other finding that I thought was important and kind of tied back to, again, that co-parenting relationship was they named residual trauma. I call them symptoms or residual trauma experiences from their childhood. So this really influenced kind of how they were able to relate to their co-parents. So if they saw their co-parenting mirroring either their affect or maybe behaviors or words of their caregiver and upbringing, they instantly went into protective mode for
Mm,
their child. They also formed this or they named that they formed this relational distrust from the get with any relationship, which trickled into their co-parent. So they didn't trust their co-parent to parent their child in the best way, which I thought really interesting how that lined out. And they specifically talked about how they had to be really intentional with wanting to break this cycle. They talked about how their parents were parented and how they intentionally want to break that pattern with their own children, which I thought was really interesting, of course. And then we ended the interviews with describe to me what a healthy co-parenting relationship looked like and any barriers that may influence that based on your experience as a childhood. So the strengths they identified were consistency and compromise. So the frequency of which they're communicating with their co-parent to keep them in the loop with their child, but
hmm
also kind of steering from this battle of like, I have to win over my co-parent to learning,
Right.
okay, how can I compromise, come to the middle, and really prioritize my child to make sure that they are taken care of and they're the main goal over themselves and their co-parent, which, makes sense, right? Barriers, I kind of already listed. One is kind of the affect piece of if they were mirrored, yelling or things that they experienced in their childhood that wasn't really conducive for a healthy co-parenting relationship. But also evolving relationship dynamics between, they specifically listed parents or relationships, right, where maybe the childhood experience happened, but also with their co-parent, if they transition from romantically involved to not, but also if the new romantic interests came involved in the co-parent's life, that created a barrier of communication.
Okay. Wonderful. The I'm hearing a lot of stuff that sounds like attachment language. And I know that when you do qualitative work, you're also supposed to use as much of the language of the interviewees as possible.
Mhm.
Did you get the sense that co-parenting dynamics were often being talked about in those sort of concrete symptom-based things, or were people already turning them into sort of abstract narratives with larger abstract ideas like attachment?
Yeah, so my sample was pretty unique. One of the questions I asked was, have you ever been to therapy before?
Mm,
Just as a therapist, I had to throw in that
sure.
control variable or that covariate. And most of my sample had been to therapy, so they already kind of had that language. Attachment really was salient throughout kind of the interview, but one thing I really, narrowed in on was almost that social learning theory and having to
Mm,
really disrupt, like, okay, this was modeled for me and I now see myself accidentally or innately doing this, how can I then disrupt that? And so it was really interesting, like kind of the ways that
yeah.
they were like, I have to be really intentional with noticing my own signals and that of my co-parent so we can work together as a team.
Okay. All right. So the majority of people watching this are from places outside of Florida,
Mhm.
and the US. So what do you think in terms of your findings so far, or maybe some hypotheses that you're seeing in the literature review or whatever that could apply some of this to populations or cultures outside the US?
Yeah, no, I think that's really important. So, as I was, preparing for this interview and really wanted it to be applied to a broader audience, I pulled some stats from the World Health Organization, and some of these, I mean, I don't think I put numbers to this outside of the US, but in 2024, they said 6 in 10 children, or approximately 400 children under the age of 5, regularly suffer from physical punishment or abuse or
Mm,
psychological violence at the hands of caregivers or parents, really highlighting that this is an interpersonal issue, or it
mhm,
starts with the relationship. We often know within the literature that if we experience this as a child, right, this abuse or maybe maladaptive patterns, we're more likely to engage in romantic relationships where abuse is present, again, then perpetuating this cycle. So, when we think about this from a global perspective, we can see that children are experiencing adverse childhood experiences at kind of an alarming rate. I mean, that number, 400 million, I started picturing clients that I work with, and I was like, oh, there's 400 million of you guys out there. Um, that my participants kind of named this, that even though this is happening, this doesn't have to be the story of your life. Breaking this cycle of childhood trauma, it's not a passive process. It takes a lot of hard work, but it's a very intentional, conscious choice to choose differently. And, with my research, but also specifically my dissertation, the findings potentially suggest that while ACEs profoundly shape how parents view their roles as co-parents and parents, the mechanisms of success lie in the intentionality of the relationship. So, relationships, whether that be with a therapist or whether it be with your co parent,
yeah.
can be a source of strength and healing if we attune to one another's needs, but understand each other's history. And I think that's how we can apply it globally if relationships heal the world. And I think that's part of the
Mm.
reason I became a systemic therapist.
Yeah. All right. So, and then, yes, you're not focused necessarily on all the interventions and whatnot that could be applied to this. Um, are there some simple interventions or ideas that you think you could uh, that could translate culturally for some of this relational healing you're talking about?
Yeah, so one thing that I was reflecting on, just like in my own work, right, is I think when I work with kids, I do parent sessions, but I don't always do a good job bringing in every adult that's involved in that child's life. So when we
Gotcha.
think about simple intervention or even just intervention in general, we should be getting the story from several different vantage points and making sure we're all on the same page. Because sometimes what I've realized, if I only have biological mother and biological father, I'm missing the perspective sometimes of those step parents who have more involvement than you maybe would think or assume.
Hmm.
Specifically, with one of my interviewees, they identified their co-parents as the stepmoms, so as biological mom and stepmom, and they
Mm.
had more involvement with the child than I think I would have even assumed or realized. And they were the ones who were co-parenting versus that typical or that assumed bio mom and bio dad. So I think
Mm.
doing a thorough assessment, really inviting people to engage in that therapeutic process because we just need safe adults for our kiddos and therefore they build those safety and relationships and attachment.
Absolutely. I mean, the research is relatively clear. It doesn't matter how many adults or what versions of adults, if they are emotionally safe, physically safe, and care for the kid, that seems to be what matters.
Yeah.
Um, so, all right. This is very useful work, and I'm glad that you're doing it. I'm glad that you are almost finished with the doctorate itself, and that you're going to be presenting it at IFTA in Bergen. So thank you so much, future Dr. Lowery, for joining us, and we look forward to hearing more about you in Norway.
Yeah. Thanks again for having me here. I really enjoyed this conversation.